Hello, hello, everyone. I hope that everyone is doing well. Hmm. So, I want to say happy Friday, Shabbat Shalom. For today, I decided that it would be a good idea to go over the whole Elon Musk thing. I know. I'm not exactly the biggest fan either, But one of the things that I find very interesting is that, of course, Elon is being very mask off when it comes to this. Now, what this means is not so much that there was really a mask there to begin with. I mean, after all, he is the white South African, um, and his friend Peter Thiel is from a family that it seems, right, um, found the Union of South Africa to be too not racist enough, so they went to go live in Southwest Africa, which was then part of South Africa, to live only among Germans. So you have that as well. Again, this is just from this, of course, only speculation. But what I do think is very important to note here is how particularly anti-Semitism has entered the public space, and rather, I mean, it never went away, nor was it ever particularly hidden, and definitely not well hidden. But this is something that has to be combated on all fronts. Hello, Murder Music, ¿cómo estás? And so this is where we need to talk about the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism, even, I mean, beyond just Elon, right? Even talking about within even very principled leftists. It's again one of those blind spots that people often like to think that they're past. And this isn't like a reprimand or anything like that. This isn't the point. I hope that people see my wish to draw attention to how anti-Semitism is functioning currently, as me trying to engage in an actual discussion. Just one quick second. I see your chat. Just trying to center the video for. Okay. I mean, Israel brings out a lot of conflation with the idea of the Jewish people as bad versus the actual root, which is nationalism and imperialism in the Middle East. No, yeah, I mean, like, this is something that I myself have spoken about before, is like, again, Zionism in its when it no, that it does make sense. It makes sense, but I can see why you feel the need to ask to say that, right? Because many people, right, even Jewish organizations have tried to conflate the Jewish people with the state of Israel, which is, in my judgment, is itself anti-Semitic, but that's neither here nor there. I don't think this is not the time for that discussion, right? Instead, what we need to focus on is that, oh my goodness, thank you so much, Murder Music. Thank you so much for the subscription. I appreciate that. So again, Zionism in many ways can be seen as, and again, I say this so as to be understood that I'm thinking about Jabotinsky, I'm thinking about the very ideas laid out in the Judenstaat, and the very ideas in the actual theorists and the people that went about the colonization of Palestine had in mind. That the ideas were not dissimilar from nationalist ideas that we would term fascism, right? Like the idea of the neue Mann, right, in Germany, the new man, was mirrored in many ways in the concept of the new Jew. right? Which is something that was played off in, and it still is, uh, used in Zionist rhetoric in the state of Israel, to say that the Jews of Europe, they're pale, they're sickly, right? They live this meager existence, whereas through the creation of a nation state, then now the new Jewish man will be muscular and tan and strong and um, but people often don't realize that it's much more deeper than that, right? Like uh, intercommunal, right? Hatred or dislike, etc., or marginalization, I should say, occurred in the state of Israel when first they banned Yiddish, and then two, after the end of the Second World War, after the end of the Holocaust, there was a desire of some people to blame the Jews of Europe for, or to see them as, well, one, to shame them for having gone what they suffered through, as if somehow it was their fault on one hand, but also on the other hand, um, looking at how, um, Israel indeed wanted to, uh, right, end the culture of Jewish people that was identified in the shtetl, right? That was, in the ghettos of Warsaw, right? That was in Vilna, that was, right? To remove all of that and to instead recreate the Jewish people as a bourgeois people, which is actually something Theodor Herzl says. He says the Jewish people are a bourgeois people, which he says this because, one, he is bourgeois, and he lives in a society that has very few Jewish people, um, and one that has already integrated Jewish people into the average citizenry, right? When it comes to places like France or Germany, etc. But the vast majority of Jewish people were not bourgeois. In fact, they were peasants, in the what is called the Pale of Settlement, or if they weren't lumpen, right, they were some form of artisan, right? They were something that was very limited in scope in terms of what they could have as a profession. Um, and so, it's where Beyond the Pale comes from. Yeah. Uh, well, it's interesting you say that because I've heard two ways of reading that. One is the Pale of Settlement, but also the Pale of Settlement that existed in Ireland too. That it's beyond the Pale means it's in relation to the native Irish people as well. So I've heard that it can come from both uses. That essentially it's used in both ways, right? Um, but what I think is most important here to keep in mind is that anti-Semitism is the standard, right? Like it is. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No worries. It was great talking to you too, Murder. I'll see you soon. Um, this is how you get something like, um, oh, perfect, perfect. I'm glad to hear that. See you later. Um, uh, wait a second. So, why is it important to call out anti-Semitism as soon as it's seen, right? Well, one thing is, yes, one thing that needs to be said is believe Jewish people, right? believe Jewish people when they're saying, hey, this sounds anti-Semitic, right? This is anti-Semitic, right? This has happened to me far too long. Um, and yet it's not as though I've been incorrect. See, that's the difference. Um, like even at least in the sense of like, hey, why is it that it sounds like you're dog whistling anti-Semitism? Because that's what those people are doing, right? And Elon is just a person who, um, we could say, oh, we always kind of knew, and yet, right here he is going fully mask off on Twitter and retweeting, the Irish Nazi Keith Woods, who recently spoke at the American Renaissance Conference, which is literally like a Nazi, you know, conference. So what I want to look at is some of the coverage that's been given, which I definitely don't think it's been given enough coverage, considering bad how bad the consequences of allowing this to just slide and having the wealthiest person in the world, um, essentially the most powerful capitalist in the world, um, be given the room to blame the Jewish people as a whole. And this is where the whole, oh, but he's only talking about the ADL. The ADL is one, this does not mean that I agree with the ADL. In fact, so many Jewish people have to start with, I don't support the ADL, right? They are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, they are attacking this one organization because of the fact that that allows them to be openly anti-Semitic, right? That is the issue, right? It's not about the ADL as such, rather the fact that the ADL is a Jewish organization is part of that process of allowing for anti-Semitism to become more normalized than it already is, right? Like once you have Elon liking certain statistics, charts, right, that are posted, as if one, the data is true, two, as if the data, what it's saying, somehow feeds into anti-Semitic narratives, which, again, that is why we need to consider the fact that that anti-Semitism is something that takes on so many different forms that it cannot be simply reduced to, oh, well, in an individual, right? This is something that is systemic, right? And people often kind of lose their ability to be principled Marxist because they fall prey to conspiratorial ideas, right? And this isn't necessarily to reprimand anybody. This is not, that's not the point. In fact, quite the opposite. I want people to learn from this and to understand that, you cannot be a free speech absolutist, right? Like that cringe, liberal libertarian thing. You can't be that, right? On one hand. And two, you also can't debate Nazis, right? Like there's no such thing as debating them, right? Because they are always disingenuous, right? Lying is their thing. That's how they gain power, right? By being duplicitous, whilst accusing other people, right, of doing this. So the fact that white nationalists, anti-Semites, are finally feeling that they've done some kind of damage to this Jewish organization, right? With now Elon trying to sue the Anti-Defamation League for defamation, again, plays into the idea that there is a small group of Jewish people that run everything, right? When that is not the case, right? Not only is that not the case, but I was saying this to this kind of capitalist infighting that is occurring now in the United States is what allowed for the Habsburg group, right, to choose Adolf Hitler, for example. I'm just going to use this as a quick historical aside. The Habsburg group, which were the agricultural capital, and like the bourgeoisie of Germany that requires tariffs and a strong internal market, right? As opposed to the financial bourgeoisie, as opposed to the industrial bourgeoisie, right? Which requires strong trade networks, right? It would need exports, right? And imports too as well, and massive flows of debt. Is that, of course, when they are able to come together to decide that, well, we need someone who can instead place the full boot of fascism on just the working classes, right? And then do the Joy Through Work program, right? Where people were forced to work, to receive benefits, from the state, etc. Which now the United States does as well. Again, it's something that we need to consider vis-a-vis what is currently ongoing right now online. Like the fact that two actual Nazis, right, Nick Fuentes and Keith Woods, have joined forces, right, and since then have been essentially preparing for this, right, and instead of trying to actually, well, I guess the problem is this, right? What are people doing to minimize the harm that is going to come from this? And the answer so far has been very little, except to say, well, we should hear them out. Like, no, we don't have to hear them out. You need to listen to Jewish people when we say something is anti-Semitic, and also our other marginalized people when we say that something is racist or transphobic, etc., etc. But most of all, this is a struggle that needs to be fought collectively, right? Together we can combat this, right? But of course, now I don't want to run into pure platitudes, so we're gonna look at some of the coverage so far that's been done, mainly by Majority Report and some bourgeois media. But again, I don't want it to be lost.
Yeah, this is pretty amazing.
On us that, of course, this does immense damage to, this does result in violence against Jewish people, right? This results in violence on BIPOC. This results in violence on queer people, right? So to say, well, it doesn't matter because blah, 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 this does matter. Again, this is why even people who are very anti-ADL, but are Jewish, say, even though I hate the ADL, this is so obviously a way for them to, once again, launder their anti-Semitism under the guise of, we're just going against this one organization. But the very nature of their critique is one based in anti-Semitism, right? So we'll begin the coverage right here.
Elon Musk seems to be suing. Is he suing the ADL?
Yeah,
what's going on with this?
He is suing.
So basically,
That would be ill-advised, I think, right?
the background is essentially, free speech guy Elon Musk. He was criticized by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, essentially, because of their criticism, or they criticized X/Twitter for its lack of content moderation after Elon Musk's takeover where there was more anti-Semitism on the platform. Now, Musk is threatening to sue them. I don't think he has filed suit yet, but he's at least talking tough. And apparently, Musk, when he took over in late 2022, met with representatives from the ADL and other, anti-hate groups to say, "Don't worry, we're going to have a content moderation council," which he never put into place. Now, Sam, not sure what your experience has been on Twitter recently.
So again, like these promises of like, oh well, we're no longer going to have the old punitive form of censorship, quote unquote, right? Which it's interesting because the whole point of like Twitter is not doing well, right? Something is rotten in the house of Twitter, right? But the fact that you have Elon blaming the Jewish people for, and again, people can disagree and try to say, no, he's really just going against the ADL. But again, it never just ends with the ADL. It also does not require him having to signal boost Nazis, right? That's the problem with people who want to dismiss it, right? Like, oh, it's just, blah, blah, blah. It's also because of his transphobia, right? And something that has been said many times over is that transphobia and anti-Semitism are two things that are seen as intimately tied by fascists, right? Because both of them have this, "Hi DJ, it's so nice to see you. Welcome in." That essentially has the idea of the infiltrator, right? Becoming, this is a central thing in fascist thought, right? And Nazi thought in particular, right? That the Jewish people are somehow infiltrating the German folk, right? And and you also have the stabbing in the back narrative, et cetera, right? But it's this idea of the real, right? The true, the pure, right? That is why, like, the insult to trans women of "you'll never be a real woman" is not just transphobic, right? It goes beyond that, because this is where the anti-Semitism and the racism, etc., all come together, right? And this is something that you can see as described either in Deborah Lipstadt's Denying the Holocaust, or where she's talking about or even the four specific sort of categories of denial, right? Right, that like one of them being, oh, the Jewish people aren't unique, that we were just regular casualties of war, right? And again, this is where this form of understanding, say, the study of the Holocaust, the study of anti-Semitism, goes and dovetails very well with discussing the genocide of trans people, right? Hi, Buffy, it's so good to see you. So, in effect, what we get is this idea of the infiltrator. And this is something that Thomas Kuhne has written in his book, Belonging and Genocide, that there are two things in particular that stick out. One is the assault on masculinity, right? That someone, some people, something is actively fighting a war against masculinity, right? That the Deutsche Menschen, right, are becoming emasculated, right? And so they will use bonds, for example, this is why, for example, right, like the Hitlerjugend, right, and even other organizations, right, essentially wanted to militarize people, right? They wanted to militarize society. They wanted people, particularly boys and young men, to try to build camaraderie, right, through nationalist ideas, born of obviously prior to the First World War, but also after, right, in the Freikorps and everything. But also to forge a male bond, right? Like focusing on the male bond as the most important facet of German identity and society. Um, and any attack on the male chauvinism, on anything like toxic masculinity, as perhaps you would say today, is seen as an assault on masculinity in se. And so this is where the idea of the subversive group, right, that can enter into, right, that is one, the stabbing in the back when it comes to the myth of that in after World War One, right, played such a role in building camaraderie among veterans, right, to the point where even organizations that would have otherwise been anti-Hitler, right, or anti-Nazi in general, were willing to sink their differences when it came to creating this Volksgemeinschaft, right? Which is that Catholic organizations and Protestant organizations and even pagan organizations or Völkisch organizations began to essentially say the same thing and to see themselves as partners, right? In the defense of German men and German masculinity. So the idea of trans people, right, is something that, of course, subverts, for better or for worse, that is to say, the use of that word, the very foundation of what masculinity is. Hello there, Adadak. Oh my goodness, it's so good to see you. Ahoy hoy to yourself. Um, yeah. So so what this means is again that masculinity and these fetishized aspects of masculinity as constructed, right? Like violence, like war, like combat, etc., start to become seen as definitive, right? This is why you can, and like if you've ever gone and seen someone who's on the far right on Twitter, for example, or anywhere, they will always show pictures of like dudes boxing, of people getting into fights, of them hunting, of them. It's always similar. Hi, Judas. It's so good to see you. Welcome in. Because again, they want to say that there is something inherent about masculinity, and not only that, but that the Volksgemeinschaft, right, has a particular spirit that is united through the male bond, but that is also violent to the outside. Now, as Thomas Kuhne then writes in the next chapter, and there are other articles, if people want an article that talks about this more in depth, I'd be more than happy to, for what I'm about to speak about, I'd be more than happy to drop it in Discord. And that is the cult of German motherhood, right? And this is where, again, the trans aspect and the Jewish aspect, the only problem with meth. I mean, it's still funny though. But the point being that oh my gosh. So so when it comes to the myth of German motherhood, right? It's this fetishization of the womb, really. And you can definitely see this when it comes to TERFs, right? Swerfs as well, and also um um uh, uh, and also to the masculinist, right wing people, is that they begin to associate the defense of women, right, as something that needs to be done against some external enemy, right? One especially that infiltrates, right? And in the German case, it was always the idea that the Jewish men wanted to subvert Jewish women, and the Jewish women would try to subvert Jewish men, right? But it was typically Jewish men with German women. Like, that's how they always imagined it, right? Which wasn't the case. I mean, again, the population of Jewish people in Germany was like just under 1%. So this like anxiety about this is completely unfounded, of course, but doesn't matter, right? Because it's feeding off of, one, the construction of masculinity, two, the construction of femininity, and then saying that both of them are being attacked. And the way in which this interconnects when it comes to trans people is that spaces that are supposed to be female spaces, right, women's spaces, are now, in their mind, right? I mean, this is why they bring up bathroom stuff all the time, right? Because the idea of a space that is symbolically, anyway, for one sex or the other, so to speak, the idea of the infiltrator is something that goes and they see as harming in some form, right? Either symbolically or, possibly literally, the fetishized womb, right? And this is why the Lebensborn program, right? Like this idea that they were going to have like breeding pairs of human beings, right, that were pure Aryans, and it's like they mix safe spaces and segregations. Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, exactly, because for them, like in a white supremacist society, white spaces are the norm, right? And they are safe spaces and segregated spaces for them. And so people that can transcend or can go across those boundaries are things that put those boundaries into question, which is why in the myth of the, in the forging of the male bond and in the myth of German motherhood, it becomes, yeah, that was Heinrich Himmler's project to create an Aryan sort of knight aristocrat class. Right, and he actually got it from Dare. Dare is he wrote the book that where the following phrase, right, where the term blood and soil comes from, because he wrote the book called the new nobility of blood and soil, right? Essentially saying that like we need to that the old aristocracy, right, or the old nobility, right, they're all corrupted, and that through the Volksgemeinschaft, right, through the nationalist pure ideals of Aryanism, of Aryans, right, that then they would create the true aristocracy, right, the true nobility, right, people who were, by being purely Aryan, right, and so and I mean he wrote a whole book on this, and it's interesting because that phrase has, like, ever since it was coined, has had stock ever since. Like, blood and soil is still used to this day. But it just goes to show again how pervasive these ideas are, because, and this is very important, is that those ideas actually come from something much older, but that are not expressed in just that simple phrase, right? The idea of the more 15th century, 16th century racial genesis or ethnogenesis as well, was essentially founded on those ideas, right? Like, the idea was, for example, in the Spanish colony of New Spain, was that, like, there was whites, right, Europeans, Spaniards, I mean, Then there were mestizos that were mixed with indigenous people, and black people, right? And the the rate of admixture, right, determined what positions along the social ladder you could have. However, when it came to white people, it was not just purity of blood, as they called it, but it was also whether they were born as a criollo, that means, or a creole, that means born in the Americas, or born in as a peninsular, or from the peninsula in Spain. So that's literally blood and soul. That's literally believing that a person born here that's white is fundamentally, ontologically different from someone born in Europe that's white. And so those ideas, right? Those ideas are part of what later becomes, well, this is what eventually leads to the expulsion, like sort of like what the U.S. did, right, where it expelled the loyalists, right, to Canada, etc. And then the people that were here, they essentially stole all of their property. I mean, technically, that's what they did. They said, oh, all of their property is now forfeit, and now we can take it. Like, people often forget that not like the Revolutionary War, quote unquote, as it's called, was also a war to get rid of people who otherwise would have been large landowners and could have vetoed, any choices the United States made once it had declared independence. America has the opposite problem, where they see America as being intrinsically white in the same way as Europe. Neither is true. Well, right, and this is something that is different because the racial ideas that are spread by the Spanish and spread by the English are somewhat different, right? Like, for one, the Spanish did not find racial mixture as such. That is to say, it's not that it didn't come with any negatives, right? Like, it's not like it, but it was acceptable, right? Like, it was something that was seen as it's going to happen. Whereas in the United States, I should say, that was never the case. That's why they see themselves as intrinsically white in the same way, because they never, or at least, because they had like the one drop rule, right? Where by not intermixing, that's how they were able to define their whiteness, right? So by staying as European, quote unquote, as possible, which is why that idea sort of persists in the US, right? Like, this is why as soon as you begin to talk about people being white supremacists or whatever, they're like, oh, I'm not white, I'm Polish. It's like that just proves the point, because or I'm Irish, and the Irish used to, like, this is actually a book called New Immigrant Whiteness that essentially disproves all of these myths that people now tell themselves about the past. It's not saying that in the past those things did not happen, but that this belief that it is like still imminent in society is not only not true, but it has not been true for over a century, if even that, maybe even more. So regardless, so that's one aspect, right? And so, again, with the war on masculinity, which is literally something that is said, something that is still said to this day, right? I think generational trauma is real, but it doesn't mean you aren't white. Yeah, exactly. Like, like, I think, and I think you are saying this as well, is that by the second part of your sentence, is that they're thinking that by somehow appealing to ethnicity, somehow that makes up for something racial. But it's like, you know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't. All you're trying to do is to, like, them doing that is a white supremacist move, right? Like, that is a racist's move. And that's the thing that they think that that people don't understand, right? because among white people, they think that that somehow will differentiate them from one another. Speaking of landlords, the Australian Tax Office this week said that they're starting to look into harder at landlords because they made mistakes on their taxes too often under reporting their rental income. Wow. Well, I mean, well, like that's good. I mean, I hope that they can cumster and dumpster some landlords, but this is always my issue when they do stuff. I'm not saying they shouldn't, right? I want to make that very clear. Then there has to be something done, so then they don't try to like, somehow take it out on their renters, right? Because that happens, at least in America. That's happened so many times, like in LA and New York. Like, I mean, there are articles and articles about this. It's a symptom of colonization too, whether they intend to or not. They either want to take up space and talk to POC experience or wipe out the definition of whiteness. Exactly, yeah. That is part of colonization, right? That is part of extending coloniality even more, right? Epistemically, throughout society, right? It's by saying that, oh, well, if we can revert to ethnicities, which is interesting too, because when people claim this like mystical tie to the past, right? And I say this, and it'll make sense in a second. It's always with the present day nation state, right? As if Germans have only lived within the exact borders of current day Germany, right? Or Poles have only lived within the current borders of present day Poland, right? That also proves that, like, again, that their whole idea of ethnogenesis, blah blah blah, like all of that stuff, is always based in the idea that it goes to the fact that Europe's white supremacy and the United States' white supremacy are uphold one another, right? Like this is why whenever right-wing people try to act like there's some opposition between Europe and the United States, that's just cope. I mean, that's just literally just made up, because one cannot survive without the other, right? Like the Anglosphere countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc., right, that have, majority white settler populations, this is what they run off to every single time, because they think that appealing to Europeanness, that somehow that erases whiteness, but it doesn't. It just shows that whiteness started through European colonization, right? Like that's actually what they're actually getting out when they do that. Part of my family is full German, but even if you did a DNA test, it would come up with Polish because of old borders, right? And not only that, but that's actually one of the big problems with those DNA tests, besides the fact that they sell your information off to, who knows where, is that it will count certain percentages, right, of neighboring areas, and instead will put you in like, for example, like if you have a lot of northwestern Ukrainian, southeastern Polish, like, ancestry, it will count it as if you're Ashkenazi Jewish, whether or not your family's Ashkenazi Jewish or not, right? But it's because it's just it's like a scantron in a way, right? Like it's just seeing what, you know what I mean? Race science does not actually tell you anything. Like as soon as people want to try to discern meaning from it, it just shows how meaningless it is, right? Irish people are especially dire because it's a country full of indigenous people doing it, but because they're white, they'll still try to appeal to Westerners. Right, and I mean, again, like, yeah. Also, they say all Jewish people are Ashkenazi unless you get one specifically made to test Jewish background. Right, and again, that is following white supremacist logics. And in fact, I know I mentioned this to you, Judas, because I was reading these these several books, and I can list them in Discord later if you want, or I could DM them to you. Um, Race pseudoscience, making the world unsafe for non-white people for 200 years at least. At least, if you include even just the idea of like racial essentialist ideas, it goes to at least the 14th century. So there's that. Um, it's only become like more. Yeah, I can't even say that. Like, it's definitely become more totalizingly pervasive now. I've already done a DNA test because you kind of have to do it to prove to people you're indigenous and have. See, that's exactly. It's funny. It's funny you brought that up. That is exactly what these books are looking at, right? Is that they is that they are saying, why is it that the idea of blood purity that was literally invented in Europe to discriminate against Jewish people, right, by saying that this group, like people that have no Jewish ancestry, are pure of blood, and those that have some Jewish ancestry are impure, right? And then it spread into the Americas, right, to create the racial caste system that the Spanish had, for example. Why is it that indigenous groups now feel compelled to essentially use that methodology with amongst themselves, right? Like, why would you take something that has been used for genocidal purposes, right, as a way to essentialize and to justify the ongoing genocides of indigenous peoples right around the world, to then police who gets to be considered indigenous or not, right? Sounds like another way to victimize indigenous communities by making them prove that they are who they are. Right, and this is, that's essentially what the thesis of these several books are. It's like, now we're literally taking blood quantum and saying, now we have to prove it to our, like, like literally taking race science and saying, now let's apply it to our own communities. And so essentially what the authors are saying is that some of the old tests that actual scientists, mostly Nazis, were used to identify if someone was Jewish basically boiled down to looks like a Jew to me. I actually once had someone in stream tell me that I'm the most Jewish looking person that they've ever seen. And I'll never forget that. I don't remember who it was. I just remember that someone told me that. And I was like, okay. Like, like I've never, like, this is like a weird thing to be told in a Twitch chat. But yeah, a lot of indigenous communities are making waves to say it's based on ancestry, but that comes with a lot of colorism too. White people become impure, yeah, quote unquote impure, and be indigenous, but black people are already too far gone to be indigenous. Right, exactly. Exactly. And so that's what they're saying is like, why are we adopting white supremacist racialist logics to determine indigeneity when those things were created to try to erase indigeneity, right? As a way to try to get rid of it as much as possible. Exterminate it, right? That's the point, right? It's like, it's the same thing like with what Raven said. It's like those tests are like, the whole idea is just like, we cannot actually tell who is or is not Jewish. So we need a test, quote unquote, that lets us know who actually is a Jew or not. Like, this even exists even in something as far back in papal, when it comes to a papal bull that was used, saying that because the people living in Italy, right? What was the Italian peninsula? Because you could not tell Jewish people and Christian people. I'm just like, I've never really heard that. Like, I have heard people that say, like, oh, yeah, I could tell that you were Jewish, but it was just weird to say, like, I'm the most Jewish person, like, the most Jewish looking person. And I'm like, I don't think that's true. I really don't think that that's true. But, that's neither here nor there, right? Um, but one of the main things to also keep in mind is that this papal bull said, because we cannot tell apart Jewish people from non-Jewish people, right? You just look like Shakespeare to me. I mean, that's all I can hope for. Oh yeah, it always goes wrong. Like, I'm not even joking. Once I did ask, what do you mean? And they went straight for the nose. Like, I'm not even fucking joking. They went straight for the nose. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, yeah. Also, yeah, if you'd like to help out my research, you can go to my throne that's just appeared in chat. There are books on there that I need for research, and are even in this little thing, category thing, that allows you to see just those type of things. Or if you'd like to help me get an air conditioner, because the place that I live in doesn't have air conditioning, you can always help contribute to it right here. Oh, hey Arun, how are you? Nice, nice. What are you gonna get? Um, oh my goodness. You're. Oh, nice. That sounds good. Anyway, welcome to the stream. Excuse me. Or just differentiate them from whiteness. The conflict of race was solely for that, and to clarify who is more deserving of what, and that practice still lives on. I mean, yeah, exactly. Like, this is the reason why white people, right? So this is why white people think, or rather try to make it seem like when people are talking about whiteness, that we're talking about skin color, right? It's like, oh, well, I mean, like, you'll see this all the time, right? It's like, they will, you know, it's like what happened with, is his name Enrique Tarrio? Or the guy from the Proud Boys, right? Because he's like Dominican, right? And they're like, oh, he's too dark to be white. And it's like, again, because those that know how whiteness works, but also it's in their interest to pretend that they don't know, right? People forget that the first ethnic minority in England were the Saxons. Whiteness means nothing but what a society deems as white, right? And then the issue is the issue would be that now we have a global white supremacist system, right? So, like, even if you live in a country that has, very few white people living in there in the first place, it does not mean somehow it's exempted from white supremacy, right? Because that's part of the world system of capitalism, right? Like, capitalism cannot exist without colonization, imperialism, white supremacy, etc., etc. South Africa, yeah. Because it's like like this can like an example that someone could give of what you're talking about would be when Japanese people in South Africa were given legal whiteness, right? So that way they wouldn't have to be treated like and this term can be applied in the South African context, colored people, right? Because that means something in the South African context, right? But it does not mean anything in the like we do not use that term in the U.S. anymore. Um, but the point being is that they would not fall under that category, which is essentially everything that is not black, right? Everything that is not black falls into that category. So instead they gave him legal whiteness, right? In the same, again, on one hand, we have the fact that whiteness, right, was also part of the justification for chattel slavery, right? This is why when people try to compare like indentured servitude of white people, right, that happened in some of the Caribbean and even in the United States, it has it has no true relation to chattel slavery, right? Um, and that is the difference. It's like because what it's called is slavery, they look at everything else that can be classified as slavery and say that well, because it falls under the same dictionary word, that means that that must mean that they can be equivocated, which is not the case, right? Like indentured servitude, it's kind of like when people try to act like slavery of what's depicted in the Bible, particularly the Jewish Bible, was like a permanent racialized, justified by that racialization for eternity thing. It wasn't, right? Like the children of the indentured person, the slave, were not born slaves, right? It was with chattel slavery that you said that people said, in fact, they even in the U.S. they made it even more explicit, where they said the child shall follow the condition of the mother, right? So explicitly saying that it didn't matter if white men had relations, consensual or otherwise, with black women, right? In this case, they're slaves. The child, even though technically they would be half white, would not be counted as white, and would never be recognized as a legitimate child, right? So again, imagine that is a law, right? This is the reason why historians don't care about, like, oh well, this law says this. Like, laws can say whatever the fuck they want. It's how societies actually behave is what matters. That's why, like, when people point to, like, oh, the UN convention on blah blah blah, and they're like, it says this, it's like, that is not, like, historians don't care. Like they will look at that and be like, sure, but what actually happened, right? Let's see here. Also, someone tried to quote unquote own me by saying racialized people can be half white. I'm like, bro, you're so desperate to prove there's no racial hierarchy. Well, see, again, like, that's just what I was just saying, right? Like, even if we go back to the colonial instance, right, and even the early American history, right, up until the end of the Civil War, and pretty much after as well, with Jim Crow, everything was still based on this idea that there is no such thing as half. There is no such thing as half white. And we can observe that too, still existing to this day when it comes to someone like Barack Obama, right? Like, no one would call him half white. They just call him black, right? Never are people who are mixed race, at least in the American sense, right? That is, in the sense of the way how the United States thinks about race, intermarriage, etc., right? Or as it's often called, miscegenation. It never follows that you get the privilege of the one that's quote unquote higher, right? Because of white supremacy. It's always that you become associated with whatever is the quote unquote lower one, right? So again, that is, I mean, this even existed even in the reasoning why they did not want to allow New Mexico to become a state, even though it had a white population, because they weren't Anglo-white. They were not considered white enough for being given power, essentially, even though they had just had power before the war. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I do find it interesting that South Africa and the Nazis both had honorary white statuses when it was convenient. Well, yeah, I mean, and it's interesting too that both of them had it for the Japanese as well. But it just goes to show that that even to this day, right? Like, when people talk about the West, they, to some extent, do want to include Japan and have tried to include Japan in that, right? It's like when they talk about, like, when they try to orientalize, right, they specifically mean the imperialism like the scale of imperialism and colonialism that Japan did is kind of like shows that it is not part of the orientalized East, so to speak, right? Because it's something else, right? Because it modernized, it blah blah blah, right? Like they love to talk about how like, oh, why didn't China just do what Japan did? As if, you know, again, this is how white people will try to think of things. This is why white people always bring up this whole like the idea that like about Africa and the wheel, as if one, the wheel is the best form of transport, which it isn't, and also as if somehow like, I mean, because one, they think of it like a tech tree, right? Like if you don't have the wheel, that means you can't have like large, stable, agrarian cultures with cities or anything. It's like in Egypt, for example, the reason why they didn't find any use for it, or rather in West Africa, like in Ghana, Togo, etc., is because there's so many rivers. It makes more sense to travel on upstream. That's something even the colonists, the British, said like, no, don't use a wheeled cart. No, just sail it up the river because the rivers go all over the place. There's no reason to try to go through all of the different biomes and microbiomes of these areas because it's just not suitable for wheel transport. Which is why, again, when people focus on the wheel as something, because one, they imagined the wheel as something on one hand that is like, one was developed in Europe, which it wasn't. And another thing too is like, if like, then right, on the other hand, then you could say, well, the Europeans never developed their own independent writing system. So what, you know what I mean? Because like that's how dumb that example is, right? But it works on people, especially like younger people, unfortunately, because they tend to one thing is we are taught things through this way, right? Like, oh, because they never had the wheel, therefore they never had the train, therefore they never had cars, therefore they never had this, right? Which is just wrong. But it's a way to also excuse colonialism, right? Because that's how the colonists have always tried to justify it. That like, oh, they did not know what to actually do with their land because they weren't properly using it. We went in there and we used that land that was theirs, and used it for the correct purpose, which was for capitalism, right? For exploitation. New Zealand, they made Maori fight for honorary white status. And by that they meant we're British citizens now and are colonized even more because they're allowed to imprison us. Oh, God. He got the treatment by white people that my mom warned me of. She just warned that a lot of my white friends may shift blame from something onto you just because you're an easy scapegoat. Obviously, I can't be sure, but that man got 22 years for being in a position of authority with a... Yes! Raven, that is exactly what... I said that. I said the same thing. Like, isn't it weird that of all of the people, like, even with people that were actually at the Capitol, right? At the Capitol building, none of them got as high of a sentence as Enrique Tarrio. None of them. And there were people, I mean, there are people that were as it were, field commanders, right, so to speak, right? At least in their minds, right, in their LARPy ass minds. But the point being that like there were people whose money was used to get people there, and yet they were still there present, and they were there partaking in the insurrection. And that guy got like what, 10 years? Why is it that what is the difference between Enrique Tarrio and the Oath Keepers guy? How come he gets 10 years when like their whole thing is being armed and defending the Constitution, of course, except for when it doesn't do what they want it to do. But when Enrique Tarrio, who wasn't even in Washington, D.C. that day, he's the one that gets the highest sentence. I mean, again, not that he should not be in prison. Again, and this is why like a lot of Latinx people were saying like, it's not that we think that he should be exonerated or absolved, but it's like this shows how when it's a whole bunch of white dudes, they get, you know, single digit year sentences. As soon as there's a brown person, right, regardless of how much he believed in Western chauvinism, that's who they will use as the person to, you know, be to punish. Yeah, different from self-identity, though not going to tell people they can't identify both as white and black. Or something, but in society we're not daft. We know we're mono-racial. Yeah, exactly. Like, and this is the thing too, is like, when it came to the people of New Mexico, right? Because again, all people, like the vast majority of people from Mexico are mestizos, right? That means that we are by definition mixed. I mean, the word itself means mixed, right? Mestizaje means intermixture, right? Between indigenous, European, and African ancestries. And that's, you know, and those are the three main ones from the colonial period. But it even can include, you know, people who came from East Asia, etc., right? But because that is now such a large category, people, well, one, I talked about this actually on Polly's chat yesterday, is that some nationalists in Mexico try to use the two nations, which is something that actually Canada has as well, apparently, where they have this like myth of the two nations, right? The French nation in Quebec, and then the English nation in everywhere else, but in Ontario, right? That like they form the basis of Canada, right? It's this like myth of these two nations coming together, and by nations I mean peoples, right? This was something that was really made into a national identity. This idea of mestizaje was something done by the government as a way to create a united Mexican identity that never existed prior. Because up until the Mexican Revolution, that is to say, like in the 19th century, everything was racialized. Like everything was, oh, these are white Mexicans, these are mestizos, these are indigenous people, these are black people, these are, like, there were these divisions. In fact, that's why the last census that asks racial categories is the 1895 census. Ever since then, every census in Mexico has been, it doesn't ask about race. In fact, the way how it determines whether or not someone is indigenous is whether or not they speak an indigenous language. That's how they count indigenous people, by speakers of indigenous languages. Not by, which again, I've heard some, you know, people say, you know, that's not right because, you know, because it kind of doesn't take into account the fact that there's such a thing as language dispossession, right? Which is a real thing. I mean, and it's interesting because people understand that when it comes to people who speak Spanish as their mother tongue, right? And they go to the US and then they get dispossessed of the Spanish language. But when it comes to inside Mexico, that anti-indigenous racism, which has been here since, you know, the first Spaniards set foot on the shores of Veracruz, is so deeply entwined with Mexican identity. And also, I mean, with the rest of Latin America as well. Because there's anti-indigenous racism and anti-blackness, anti-black racism that is endemic. I mean, it's just everywhere in Latin America. In fact, insults in Mexico are saying, don't be a blank, right? In the sense of calling someone in a pejorative way in indigenous person, right? Or, oh, you're acting like an indigenous person. Oh, you talk like an indigenous person, right? Because that's a way of saying that you are not proper, or that you are not, as intelligent, or that you are not as, many different things, right? It's used to mean many, many insults. Like, don't be a blank, right? And it's always pejorative, right? Wait, New Mexico isn't white enough, but Hawaii is? Okay, so what happened? No, this actually was a question when it came to Hawaii, was that they only let New Mexico become a state once the majority population was Anglo white people, right? This is actually the reason why they did not want Hawaii to become a state of the United States, because it, of course, has the indigenous population and a large East Asian Pacific Islander population as well. So this is why you get a larger movement of people from the United States, like from stateside, so to speak, to Hawaii, after World War II, right, to essentially get that Anglo white majority to then give them a reason to make it into it. Otherwise, had Hawaii never had that, this is not to say that it was good, then it would have just remained a colony, right? Like, that is the reason why Puerto Rico, even though it's majority white, because they're non-Anglo whites, right? They're descendants of Spanish people, and of course there's intermixture between indigenous peoples and black people as well. They do not want it to become a state. Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! Thank you so much, NCC. Thank you so much for the raid. Welcome in, everyone. I am Shakespeare. I am a cultural historian, and I am currently streaming on talking about make sure to go and follow No Comment Chick, so then that way we can. Hello, Jules. It's so nice to see you. Like I said, we're just talking about kind of like colonialism, and the way how that has affected, how people think about race and whiteness, etc. And also we're talking about this in the context of Elon Musk going full mask off, anti-Semitic. So, but anyway, thank you so much, Irene. I hope if you're still in here, how did your stream go? And what did you get up to talking about? So they did that with Hawaii as well. That's why Hawaii is the last state in 1959, right? Like, that's why Alaska's first, right? In fact, when New Mexico was trying to become a state, initially it was going to be one big state that also included Arizona, right? But because Arizona actually had a large white Anglo, American population in central Arizona, where it's like up in the mountains, like where Flagstaff going down a little bit, like not in what, like now I think the largest city was probably Phoenix, right? Like in southern Arizona, which Tucson, Arizona is a colonial city, like in the sense that it has existed there since Spanish times, right? And in fact, the oldest building in what is now the United States is in Tucson. It is the Saint Xavier del Bac mission, right? It's still, in its Baroque style, and it still serves the original community it was built to serve. That is the Tohono O'odham people, from what and that was the last part of the contiguous United States that became part of the country in 1853 with the Gadsden Purchase. But yes, so they initially were going to have a big New Mexico, and then they cut off Arizona, like they just split it in half and said, well, because this side has more Anglo immigration, and now has a majority. It was a fairly substantial majority. They gave them statehood first, and then like a decade or two later, then they gave New Mexico statehood. Only when the vast majority of all of the positions in power and the population in general was majority Anglo. Right? So they do that to Pacific Islanders too. Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all of the Americas are colonized. And not only that, but it's like all of the states in the Americas are settler colonial states. So that is something that is often one, like people can understand that to some extent when it comes to say Canada and the United States. But remember, like in every country in Latin America, the bourgeoisie is almost entirely white. In fact, the best indicator that, like in Mexico, the major landowners of the 19th century are still the major landowners of now, right? And they're the major industrialists and the major, and so the fact that Mexico is also very imperialized, again, is just showing more again how, I mean, this is why like Carlos Slim, right, the richest man in Mexico, he once was the richest man in the world, like owns like essentially all Mexican media. Like he owns like every okay, maybe not every single one, but he owns like a monopoly of so many different things that it's like everything is just under his. And it's interesting too because the only reason why that was even possible is because of the liberalization that was forced upon Mexico when Carlos Salinas de Gortari signed up Mexico to become part of NAFTA, right? And essentially forced Mexico to open up its domestic market to the United States, to be even more imperialized. Yeah, he was always there as a shield. Yeah, because they would always say like, well, he's Dominican, which one, Dominican isn't a race, but two, right? It's like, come on, like, it's just, the only reason he wasn't there was because, yeah, exactly, he was kicked out the day before, and he was at his hotel room in Baltimore. Hello, everyone. Oh, hello. Yes, I am having a good day. Hope you're having a good day as well. I'm listening to the Deprogram podcast. Can't remember which episode, and Yugopnik is talking about how people in Yugoslavia had racist views of Native Americans when kids do something bad. The relative, yeah, like exactly what. Yes, what you just wrote, the don't act as an Indian. Yes, that's exactly that. But in Spanish is a way that is, I mean, but they even say it in another way, right? Which is to say they add a diminutive, which emphasizes the fact that it is supposed to be derogatory, right? Like, they don't say indio, they say indito, right? And that is supposed to, again, make it clear that that racial division is one of some magnitude and that it's debasing to be identified with that, right? And the stereotypes that non-indigenous Mexicans have vis-a-vis, the indigenous peoples. So yeah, that's very similar. Yugoslavia actually media music educate how those movies slide. That's interesting. I mean, I do know that Western films, like like Westerns, like certain things that were kind of I almost want to say like stereotypical, I guess. That kind of were like, yes, this is what America is. Were more likely to get accepted behind censors, for whatever reason. I don't know why that is, but that's why like most of the world has seen like John Wayne, like the John Wayne stuff, like when Ronald Reagan played him and everything, like I never quite understood why, but that seems to be because it's like a classic American image, right? That's why it was allowed. We talked about Jimmy Dore and Cornel West on NCC stream. Oh, that sounds interesting. I do know that Cornell West apparently didn't take too kind to Jimmy Dore, like in his trying to, well, because doesn't, if I remember correctly, I've only watched a little bit, but Jimmy Dore essentially is kind of like, let me give you advice. Like, I want to be your coach, right? Like, doesn't he say something like that? Or am I misremembering? I hope Father Kino's running hell. Oh, I mean, yeah. Ugopnik was specifically talking about his family members. Oh, okay. God, not John Wayne. I know. But it's like I remember in Mexico there were like okay, good. Thank you, Cat. Um I remember that like there were movies that were from China, right? And that were allowed to air like all day long on Southern Californian television, technically in Tijuana as well, because they were like karate movies, like they, like, you know what I mean? Like, rather, they were like kung fu movies, right? Where there's like no dialogue. It's just like, or rather, if there is dialogue, it's not in English, and it's very minimal, and it's just people going around and fighting, right? So like those classic, you know, samurai movies, and I mean, I know I'm saying samurai, which of course is Japanese, but I think that somehow those are more commonly watched in the United States, because this was something that like my grandfather would watch, right? And because he was a Spanish speaker, and so when we were living in Tijuana, like I just remember like every summer he would just have that channel on. We don't even know which channel it was either. Like literally, like I've tried to find it again, never have been able to find. Like we have no idea how he found it, but he just would just like flip through the channels, and then would just, yeah, kind of like Jackie Chan movies, exactly, like Hidden Tiger, Crouching Dragon, like that, right? But it's like I mean, like they were like black and white, so that's kind of what sticks out to me, because they were very old films, which now actually, like, because I kind of remember that in my childhood back in Tijuana, it actually has let me appreciate a lot of the early black and white cinema that was created in China. Um, what do you mean? Who are you responding to? Um, and it's so stupid to build stereotypes for movies of the 1800s. Yeah, yes, yeah. Like that they depict, yeah. Um, are from a colonization area. Like you can point to to English person from the 1800s and build a view that English people are uncultured. I missed most of the Jimmy Dore thing. What I saw sounded like Jimmy Dore lecturing Cornel West on how conspiracy theories are true. You know, um, okay. Um, well, no, I just think that like well, see, because like my grandfather never did the whole uh like uh like my family mostly spoke in Spanish, right? So like he wanted to find stuff that was either had little dialogue, so there's no need to, know what's being said, or that's in Spanish. And I mean, you can only watch, like for me, like the fact that like the Spanish language, like here in LA, right? Because they have like Channel 34, which is like where they have like Sábado Gigante and all that stuff, right? Like the morning stuff where they're talking about sports and like dumb video. It's like like that was like TikTok before TikTok was even a thing, right? Because like it's all these like meme, like funny videos, whatever, blah blah blah, and I'm just like, I don't know. I never liked it growing up. I was just like, I don't like this. So like when I would see, movies or documentaries, I would just watch that. Um, but Jimmy Dore is a perfect example of. I mean, we all know that he's like a right winger, but like the fact that he definitely had this guise of being supposedly right left wing, right? or at least progressive, right? Is like they are the people who love lecturing BIPOC the most. Um, like, and it's so weird, right? Like it's such a weird thing that I've been subjected to myself, where like progressive people will tell me like, oh, it's like, why is it that, you in your academic work, you're talking about like white supremacy and whiteness, like, oh, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's kind of like, trying to tell me like the way how you actually make it is by blah, 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 right? Essentially saying, stop talking about how racist everyone is, and I'm like, no, like, that's not gonna stop. Uh, did you see the Chinese Mulan movie? I always heard it's way. I have never seen it. Unfortunately, I haven't watched a lot of movies since then. Since for like years. Like, there was a time when, so there used to be this movie theater, back in the part of LA that my grandparents lived in. It's gone. I don't. It's not around anymore. But I mean, it existed until very recently. So it's not like, oh, it was back in the 80s or something. But if you sat in the back, they actually had like a little like closed off, almost like a VIP booth, right? Like a little VIP section. And I loved sitting back there because it felt cool, right? Because you're like, oh, where I'm in this like it's slightly raised up higher, you have no one behind you, and you're slightly raised above, so you can see past everybody. And that also tells you the type of theater it was, right? It's old because it wasn't stadium seating, right? It was more that like slanted floor, right? Almost like a French drain, anyway. And like we would go watch movies there. But and then at home, I don't know. I think the thing is that my parents had very distinct tastes in films, and so they didn't like to just put on a movie, right? Like they wanted, like, if they found something boring or something, whatever, they would just be like, like, no. Because I know like a lot of people that will watch a movie regardless of whether they are enjoying it or not, but just to watch a movie, right? Just to have something. Mulan was basically a Jedi. I have to see it. Like I've seen the Chinese version. It's like set in like medieval China, or yeah, no, I guess it would technically would be, well, early modern China. So like 16th, 17th century China. Um and it is like Romeo and Juliet, right? We have a movie theater here that was a theater in the old days and still has a balcony and boxes. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like when that theater first opened, which I mean this is in LA, right? So like, so in the sense that this is an old theater, right? It was an old theater until they, and now I think it's like a shoe store. Like I think they tore it down and built like a strip mall, right? Because it had quite a few theaters, um, uh, but some of them were really narrow too. That's what showed the age, right? That like they had narrow movie projection rooms, right? Um, and so, oh, Art Deco, yeah, no, yeah, this one was nice. It was kind of like that Mayan revival, I guess is the way of the technical term for the architecture. It's always been used in LA. Like it's used at the is it the Aztec Theater, or is it the, now I'm like, like, here in America they would call something the Aztec Theater and yet have it in like neo Mayan style, right? I think it's the Aztec Theater in Hollywood. I don't know why I'm forgetting it right now. But like it was kind of along those lines, right? So because I mean this area even back then, because it was still a very rather Mexican neighborhood, and so it was like, I mean, they actually had pictures back when like certain films came out, like in their long history, um because at one point it was like the first theater in that whole area. But as soon as someone bought it out, which everyone knew was going to happen, like the mayor or the city council said, we want to preserve history, whatever, blah blah blah, and they try to do like a charity event for it, and they're like, no, actually, all that money that was raised was illegally raised because they can't do charity on a building that is going to be sold off. Uh, and so they sold it off, and now it's like a strip mall, and where like the main entrance and like the main atrium, I guess, was, that's now like a shoe store. But anyway, neither here nor there. But yeah, it had like boxes as well, just like as you were describing. It wasn't a theater, but it still had those boxes because it was just that old. It was like from like, I want to say from like 1940 something. I mean, it was from like the 40s. It was built back then. So, anyway, so back to our discussion here.
But you have said, at least to us off camera, that the number of times you've been called a Jew in your mentions has been exponentially increasing.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that fair
There
to
is
say?
never an exchange I have with anybody where
So-
I don't get reminded that I am Jewish
Yeah.
in some fashion or.
See, this right here, I get this to some extent, right? Like this happens a lot, right? Where people will say, well, will be like, oh, you're just blah blah blah, right? They will bring, they're like, of course you think this because you're et cetera, right? But the other one that I get far more would be Mexican, right? Like I've said this before, white people will never let me forget, so to speak, that I'm Mexican, because they always, just like Sam is talking about, like, oh, there isn't a conversation I'll have where people don't bring up the fact that he's Jewish. For me, just out in the regular, just out and about, and like, people will bring up, oh, Mexican stuff, or assumptions about Mexicans, and then bring up the fact that, oh, but because you're Mexican, right, and your culture, quote unquote. And I'm like, oh my god, these people are so fucking racist. And so, like, I even remember once I had like an ex of mine who, like, they were fine, but when I met the parents, that went straight to hell. Like, it just was like, oh, we decided to like make the food of your culture, like essentially like something like that, and they made like hard shell tacos, and I'm like, I literally said, like, I'm not from Texas, and they're like, what do you mean? It's like, this is like Tex-Mex food. Anyway, but that was back then. This was years and years ago. But they were just like so confused because they're like, what do you mean? Like, this is Mexican food. Like, not for me. Like, when people say they're fascinated by Maori culture, I automatically know they think of Maori culture as living in huts and praying to trees. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like, they also do this in another way too that also misgenders me, right? Is that they say, like, of course, like, Mexican guys, they all know how to fix cars. They're all really good with cars. Or, like, stuff like that. Like, oh, I'm like, oh, I'm sure that you've had to blah, 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 right? Insert, stereotypical Mexican job here, right? And they will do that a lot too, because they never know any, right, exactly. And yeah, it's always stuff from like back in the 80s or whatever, where like they will talk as though like the main character from the movie I Was Born in East LA is like how Mexican people in LA still speak, or ever spoke. um but we'll feel like I get what you mean, that you be kind of mad when it's true, but it's like well, like let me give you an example. Once my parents went on a trip together, and they got free tickets to go see a show, right? It didn't specify which show because it changed every night. And they went there, and it turned out to be stand-up comedy, right? And first, that's not comedy. And two, it was that like, oh, tell me about like you, right? Like where they point people out in the audience and they start to essentially just berate you, right? And they said that someone near them said his name, which was Julio, and right away, what does the white guy, the white comedian, start to do? Say, oh, I bet you're a landscaper, right? Like literally nothing but racism the entire time. But the difference is that it doesn't even matter whether it's true, right? Like he, even if Julio would have been one, it's not as though that's correct, if you know what I mean, right? It's like they're not talking about him anymore, right? They're talking about the racist effigy, so to speak, that white supremacy creates of Mexican people, right? And anti-Mexican racism in the United States, especially, is something that is not only acceptable, but is in many ways seen in a positive light to some degree, at least in the sense that people can use it all the time. Right? Like it's not just Family Guy, right? Where Peter is a housekeeper, right? It's not just that lady also in Family Guy. It's not just this. It's not, right? Like it just starts to raise and until you realize that literally every chance white people get in American media, they make some racist comments or show racist depictions of Mexicans. Hello, old Miss Frizzle. It's so nice to see you. Thank you so much. I'm so appreciative that you're sending me lots of love. I definitely need it. Definitely need it.
Mother.
So,
And it's not like,
yeah,
happy Passover.
Right.
You know what I'm getting.
I'm not shocked by that. So the ADL, among other groups, basically called out Twitter, and said advertisers, look, there's too much hate on this platform, and called on them to.
And like this is the thing. Now that Elon is suing for defamation, there is so much evidence of even people like posting pictures of their ads, like advertisers of their ads showing up when next to right-wing extremist content, right? Because now it's allowed on Twitter. But in that same way too, it's like the whole premise is on this idea that because the ADL said something, right? Because they noted that a particular kind of hatred did happen, which it is true. It is very pervasive on Twitter. Oh, yeah. Elon just showed that there was never a mask. He has been like, he retweeted a Nazi that started up this hashtag. Like, technically, Nick Fuentes started it alongside Keith Woods, who's an Irish Nazi. And Elon retweeted it where it says ban the ADL. He's been, replying to like Nazi charts that try to say that like Jews are subversive in, white societies, blah, 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 as if there is such a thing. But everything like that, like, and just blaming the Jewish people for him being dumb, essentially. Because he's blaming the Jewish people for the fact that Twitter is losing revenue.
Not do business.
Just to historicize a little bit, the ADL has given Musk a lot of chances, saying they were cautiously optimistic when he took over, and then just to remind folks, like the Kanye West thing also happened.
Yes.
Where Elon's like playing footsie with that, and then this is like just the last straw because he's so clearly gone in this direction.
I mean, and he does this on purpose, by the way, because this is his ideology. What was the name of that writer that the Huffington Post or HuffPost exposed for having the pseudonym?
Oh, Hanania?
Hanania.
Elon followed him after that.
Yeah.
Elon has no one to blame but himself, but that's the thing, is he can never take the blame, right? Like, that's the thing. I mean, the fact that all of these different things that have constellated together to give Elon this power, right, is, or rather, to the power right now to sort of create a megaphone for the worst white supremacist stuff possible. And not only that, but also going into the trope of, rather, saying that he's going to sue the ADL, even though it's so obvious that the ADL is just a stand-in for Jewish people, right? Like, because everything is like, oh, well, the ADL does, like, look at all the connections they have to government. Look at all the connections when it comes to finance. I mean, I'm not even joking. Like, there was a little cartoon that had like a mini, like kind of like a mini me, right? Like kind of like from Austin Powers, like that, of Jonathan Greenblatt, and then on his side are these two huge bodyguards trying to go after Elon, I guess. And one of them says media, and the other one says finance. I mean, think about that. Like that. I mean, like it's very obvious that it, like, the ADL is just a stand-in, right? It's just there to make people who are going to be like, well, it's just the ADL, right? As if it isn't anti-Semitic, right? But that tells you everything, right? Because then it's saying that this Jewish organization's bodyguards are media, right? So therefore, it is in control of media and also finance. So, definitely not being explicit about that. Yeah, he has some weird breeder shit going on. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yes. And that's also why he started to blame, different, I mean, probably the ADL. The article did not specify this, but rather, was sort of speaking of it in the context of this, of him blaming social media, etc. I mean, it's kind of like the fact that Elon, like the people that he goes after, George Soros and Mark Zuckerberg, right? You know what I mean? It's like he makes it just beyond just, I mean, it's so obvious to the point that liberals are going to say there's no way that this is what it is. And that's the problem, right? That's a huge problem. Because this is not something that can be ignored, right? Like, he gave a platform to a literal Nazi that just days ago gave like a keynote address at the American Renaissance Conference, which unfortunately has nothing to do with like Renaissance fairs, which would be cool. No, instead it's all about Nazis. Just a Nazi conference, right? I fell into this rabbit hole about he and Grimes' relationship. Oh my gosh. Now Grimes is giving Q&A sessions like patriarchy is... No, oh gosh. Oh gosh, that's... I don't even know what to say about that, to be honest. But yeah, no, I mean, like, that's the reason why, like, weeks ago when he started to say that, like, oh, that, talking about, white genocide, blah, 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 in terms of South Africa, it's like, the people that say, oh, we need to be vigilant, etc., so, so that we can stop this stuff from spreading. It's too late once you have Elon saying on Twitter that the white genocide conspiracy theory is true, right? Like, once he's literally saying that shit about South African farmers, and now this with the ADL, it's like, no, like, this is not the, like, and they're even going to try to deny that this is as significant as it is, because the whole point is it's to not allow these things to happen. Because now the amplification of it is beyond, right? So,
Elon, Hanania, there was an expose that he had a pseudonym where he was writing on white supremacist websites, not just right-wing ones. And after that story broke, Elon Musk followed him on Twitter. It's a signal. This is the kind of thing that I believe in and tolerate, and I'll speak publicly in saying I oppose anti-Semitism like he does here, or hatred of any kind, and then quietly I'll give a wink and a nod to the white supremacists that I want to cater to.
It's also too fair insofar as like
I feel like it's been more than a wink and a nod. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, chat? Like, I don't know. To me personally, I think like wink and a nod was a long ass time ago. I think that to say that now, like, that's a bit more than a wink and a nod.
I didn't lose. I mean, this is almost so hammer on the head, like on the head. But I didn't lose the money. The scheming Jews
Yes,
made
exactly.
me lose all the money.
Right.
I mean, just think about that. Like, think about that the richest person on the planet, right? The richest person on the planet, the arch capitalist, one could say, is saying this. That, like, this money that I lost with Twitter is not because of anything I did. No, it's because the Jewish cabal has been in their conspiracy, right, to blah, 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 right? Like, just think about that. Like, again, I understand that people might not necessarily understand, or maybe I shouldn't even say it like that, might not necessarily want to, right, to say, this is really that bad, right? Like, I can understand on some level why some people hesitate to recognize, right, hi, Fina, it's so nice to see you. Hope you're doing well. Welcome to the stream. Like, I understand why some people might hesitate. However, when it leads to the denial of this, that is a huge problem. Because again, we're way beyond a wink and a nudge. We're way beyond, like other little sign, like this is the arch capitalist of the world, the person who whatever, is the one spreading this shit, right? He is the one that is like, let me signal boost a Nazi. I'm doing well, getting ready to go hang out with a gay dude and my new girlfriend. Ooh, awesome, awesome. Well, I hope that you and your new girlfriend, all, by the way, mazel tov on that. I hope that all goes well. I hope you have lots and lots of fun. And also, I hope you have a very good weekend too. So, again, like the people that want to say that, we wanna make, never again means never again. We want to stand. It's like, now we're already a little too late, right? It doesn't mean, however, that we should give up. No. It just means that, like, this is so beyond the pale, right? That like, for example, I didn't want to show this, and I'm not going to, but just yesterday in Florida, there was a whole, like, overpass filled with, I'm not even joking, like actual Nazi flags, and with people, chanting and doing salutes and stuff, right? And I'm just like, this gives them validation to do this stuff. I've been really liking this new book. Oh, good. That's good to hear. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm so glad to hear that. And also, yeah, I'm so glad. Yeah, red shirts. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I'm just like, look, I already knew I was never gonna go to no Florida, but like now I'm literally never gonna go because if it's like every other week that seems to be happening, um, there's no need to. And then the fact that, of course, DeSantis says nothing.
I mean, this is literally when you hear and we've had folks on to talk about this, but the question is like when you hear the white supremacists say like the blacks are taking over the country, the way that they will reconcile the fact that hey, wait a second, I'm supposed to be
Oh my gosh, you know that makes you think of that phrase like "come hell or high water," but now it's like "come hatred or hurricane."
better than them. They're supposed to be sub par to me in my humanity. The way they reconcile it is, well, it's the Jews that are controlling the blacks that have been scheming to take over.
That's great replacement theory too, right? Which is like
Totally.
the dirty, you know.
Yeah, I mean, she's about to say the part when Mexicans, and this is the part that people didn't hear when she starts saying, you know, something that is said very often about Mexicans that's racist, but people, it's still not, it still is not, again, seen as instantly negative, right? Like it's still acceptable. People get used to people used to give a shit for saying people are Nazis and genocide is false. I know. I mean, yeah, I know because I remember when like Polly and the denial box, right, when they were doing that, and again, like even this blatant racism taken straight from a page of German Nazis won't convince them. Well, again, it's because upholding white supremacy is central to all of this, right? That like we cannot pretend that unless there is an active deconstruction and eroding away of the harm that white supremacy has done by addressing it, right? And you know, all of that stuff, right? Only then could we say that we're anywhere near addressing white supremacy at all. Like, and it's just not, it's not happening. I mean, even very nice and active, you know, people that are leftists, right? It's like when it comes to whiteness, it's supposed to make you react, right? Like the questioning of whiteness, the dismantling of white supremacy, because that is part of whiteness itself, right? Like that is the whole point. So again, you know, yeah, like, and another thing too is like, there's another book by Deborah Lipstadt called Beyond Belief, where she shows that like even in 1933, newspapers from the United States, and not even like the New York Times, this is like the this would be like the Cincinnati, you know, the Cincinnati Register or whatever it is, right? Even newspapers who are far away from, you know, the much more rapid movement of news, right? Like New York or LA or etc. They were reporting, the Des Moines Clarion, whatever. They were reporting about the stuff that was happening against the Jewish people, even in 33, right? So that's why anyone that tells you, oh, it didn't like Denial Box, when he says that the Holocaust doesn't start until 1942, they're just wrong. Like it's not even a like, oh, I'm gonna play semantics, right? Because I mean that's his whole thing. It's that you literally have the experts on this, who literally did a defamation, who literally won a defamation trial where the odds were stacked against them, against David Irving, the Holocaust denier, the Hitler historian, to prove that, like, the expert, so to speak, is already there. Like, again, this is the problem when, like, this is why you cannot both sides something like this, right? Like, this is anti-Semitism. This is something that adds fuel to the fire, right? No, don't make me have to change anything. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's even when it's something minor too. I mean, like, look at how people react to something as simple as asking for pronouns, right? Like, think about that. Like, oh, I just want to make sure I address you correctly, right? Horthy was doing the Nuremberg laws. Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the reason why fascist Hungary. I mean, that's the reason why. Another thing people also sometimes get wrong, is that they focus so much on Germany that they act like everywhere else wasn't anti-Semitic. Like, why was it that every country that Hitler invaded, they found collaborationists that were willing to do all, the Holocaust? Why was it that as soon as he entered Greece, the Greek government was like, oh yeah, sure, right? Or perhaps a better example would be Hungary and Romania, right? That, like, there you have two countries that, like, immediately were like, yes, we want to collaborate with you. It's not because they somehow debated them in the free marketplace of ideas. It's that anti-Semitism was already pervasive in every European society. And it's not just direct deaths. The ghettos count as genocide. Exactly. That as well, right? And not only that, but this is something that even the process of Aryanization, of saying that Jews have to give up their property so then that way they can sell it off to Aryans, right? That started in 1933. Like, that started as soon as the Nazis came into power. That is genocide. So as much as all of the casuistry that people want to do when they focus on the Wannsee-Konferenz, right, is just to distract from the fact that that was the final solution. Not the first, the final. Even in 1939 and 1940 and 1941, everywhere where they went, they had the SS going there, and mass graves of innocent Jewish people, among others. That was genocide as well. So to say, oh, it only starts at the 42, is literally genocide denial. So anyway, and it's minimization at any rate. Even how Jewish people were treated by English liberators. I mean, again, it's like Bensoussan said, no concentration camp was ever liberated on the orders of anybody. The only reason why the Red Army and every other army even liberated them was because they were major logistical centers. Again, there were never any orders to liberate concentration camps. People forget this. This is why the people that say, it was blank, 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 if it wasn't for blank, you wouldn't be blank. No. There was never any order from the British, the US, or from the Soviets in particular, or even, that ever said that they had to liberate concentration camps. The reason why they told the people to leave concentration camps was because then they would have access to all of the munitions and all of the material that were at those places. Because remember, you have tons of soldiers, you have tons of guards, you have all of this food, you have all of this water. Again, Bensoussan talks about this in the book, Auschwitz by Inheritance. Well, I mean, I only know its Spanish title, Auschwitz por Herencia. But that's the whole point. It's like, That's the reason why the Jewish people, that's why when it comes to talking about the Holocaust, it literally is something that is unbelievably it's just incomprehensible. Because again, no one came to save us. They just happened to have opened a door and let us out. And yet, of course, they take all of this credit for that. But again, the fact that even afterwards, like the Soviet Union stopped the Black Book of the Holocaust from being written by Vasily Grossman, right? And then censored Vasily Grossman from publishing his book, Life and Fate. It's like he was one of the frontline journalists that wrote the series, which is The People Immortal, Stalingrad, and Life and Fate, which are like not even known in Russia, for one, because they were banned, and all of this stuff because they no longer wanted that. So again, anyway, now we're going off the point, but Romania was pretty weird. Oh yeah, and this is why when we say there is a genocide against trans, but genocide against people of color, it's not an exaggeration. Yeah, because they try to act like, well, the UN defined a genocide as this, but it's like, well, one, even then, they have made amendments, right? And all of that stuff. They've added things to clarify because, like, it's not like, for example, like with the amendments to the Constitution, right? I'm thinking about that. That is not the end-all, be-all, right? There has been case law that has established precedent, right? That says, okay, this is what is protected and this is what is not, right? That is what you have to ignore. And that's indeed what people do ignore, like debate bros, because they, by definition, only operate under confirmation bias, right? They only care about repeating the same points over and over and over because they think that wins, right? It's not even rhetoric. It's just endless repetition. Romania was pretty weird. The king at one point was killing, yeah. Oh yeah, yes. Yes, because there was that period where that was when they had a king, but they still had the Iron Guard in power, right? I was just gonna say that the U.S. sure takes credit for saving people from concentration camps. It's all about feeding youth, which again doesn't even make sense when you consider the fact that most of the concentration camps were on the other side. That is to say, on the Soviet front, right, on the Eastern Front. Like the only ones that were, the ones that happened to be in France and in West Germany were a very few in number, whereas the largest, right, where most Jewish people and most Romani people and most etc. were in the East. So I want to make sure I'm not diminishing the role of the Red Army in terms of like defeating fascism, at least in terms of defeating Germany's fascism, right? But it's not like the United States denazified. Britain didn't denazify because they didn't have to, and that's why we have what we have now, because again, I mean, I knew for people for a long time that did actually, like, I remember growing up, like, they would try to act as if the United States did liberate all of the concentration camps. Which I'm like, but you just showed us a map that said that the Americans were never in Poland. So how could that be? Right? Like, when I was young, I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. You're saying that America suddenly, like, teleported to the other side of the front lines, to the Eastern Front, for one day to liberate different concentration. Like, it didn't make any sense, but you're just taught this, right? Like, America did everything good, right? So anyway, um, big powers kind of engineered. Yes, exactly. And another thing too is when people try to talk about how like the Soviet Union didn't want XY definition to be put in the whatever. Um, do note that the Soviet Union was not the only country that didn't want that, right? Like if the one that I'm thinking of is like political um, political persecution. Um, the British didn't want that either, right? Um, so, oh my gosh, thank you so much, Jules. Thank you so much for the subscription. Yay, 3 months. Only, oh, hi, DJ. It's good to see you. That is such a cute little lurking emote. I love it. Only Canada outright caught up in the definition. I mean, and obviously US. Or wait, I don't know. I don't want to misunderstand you. What do you mean by that? Because the way how I read it is only Canada and the US have updated or have caught up to that definition. So I don't want to misinterpret what you said. Deco for one. Oh, thanks. Oh, thanks so much, Jules. Yeah, I know. Ads. Deco for one, which was liberated by an American army of mostly Japanese volunteers recruited through the internment camps and who fought their way through Italy. So, look, I talk about Inyo County a lot, and I talk about how you should never go there. That is because when I went there, right, and this is a county that is on the other side of the Sierra Mountains, right, like on the other side of Mount Whitney. So literally, like the thin strip of low foothills before you reach the Nevada border, right, the western Nevada border, right. Inyo County is famous for one thing, and that is because it had the largest of those internment camps, Manzanar, there. And all I'm going to say is this: I've never been to a place where they were so happy or like they were so proud and overjoyed to try to show you around a concentration camp like that. Like ever. Right? Like that's why I say that. I say it to some degree, jokingly, but also not. Like no, I'm not joking when I say that they literally are like if you go to the little town where just outside Manzanar, like they are proud of that. I'm not even joking. Because it's very white, very right wing, right? There have been, you know, Nazi groups that are trying to like buy small towns up, right, for themselves. And then there are like, you have the rest of the people there that are just like, do you want to go look at our concentration camp? It's like, that's why I tell people just don't go to Inyo County, right? Like, just don't go. Um, you know, it's yeah, because again, it was scary being there. I have to be honest. Like, it was really fucking scary because one, of course, being Mexican, right? They're already like, you're not from around these parts, are you? Right? But also, I'm like, if well, anyway, I don't think I even need to keep on going. I think people can already figure out what I'm going to say. Canada was actively doing it when it was defined the word genocide. When the word got coined, the previous genocides were not added up. They started with the Holocaust, right? With the exception of the Armenian genocide, right? Like that's the only one that was in retrospect. That wasn't like it wasn't, which even then, I mean, yeah, um, yeah. Uh, yeah, they didn't. The Armenian one was added later, and that's what I'm saying. Like it was done in retrospect, after they had already defined it and already started. Like it was after they already did like the Nuremberg trials and after they already did, et cetera, right? But yeah, because I mean the Nuremberg trials went on like for like the main ones happened right after the war, right? But the ones that happened like they kept going on for like a couple of decades. I think it went on into the 60s. Um, because well, yeah, because of the fact that there were just so many people, right? But like the most important people got prosecuted first. So but don't a lot of countries not recognize? That is true, yeah. And in fact, that's what I was thinking, Jules. That's what I was like. Well, like I'm saying that, but I'm also thinking about how a lot of countries don't recognize it because one, if they recognized it, then it also would apply to them, right? Like then they would be admitting, it would incriminate them. Yeah, but these were minor trials. They were not the big trials that like people think of where it's like, where it was like Göring. With Operation Gladio, they went reverse. What do you mean? Just the first round of Nuremberg trials went on long enough. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The governor of occupied Poland, yeah, yeah, was able to write a book while awaiting trial. I mean, Albert Speer also wrote a book. Remember, like, inside the Third Reich, right? Um, did that, and that's actually because he was willing to kind of like. I think this was the wrong choice. Oh, yes, but Gladio was like high ranking, high ranking Nazis, like you know, like people that were in government, people that were in, the military. I'm talking about like they had trials that were trials about that, but it was for like, it's kind of like how now there are still trials with guards, right? But there are people who are still alive that were much much more than that who are celebrated, German politicians, right? So post-war German politicians, right? So yeah, so yes, you're right about Operation Gladio, right? Especially in relation to like NATO, yes. But I'm saying how like they still had trials that were associated with this, with the mandate of that court going on for decades. Because now it's no longer with that initial Nuremberg court mandate. Like now they don't use that same system anymore when they do try people now for that. But yeah, I mean yeah, and they went on for a long time. They went on for a long time. I mean, like for example, like this is sort of related. It's like the Eichmann trial, right? When the Israeli Mossad went to the guy who wrote the Nuremberg laws and took part in the voting of the final solution got only a 500 marks fine and less than 3 years in prison. That sounds about right, yeah. Um, um, Not Heydrich. What's his name? Because Heydrich died when he was the butcher of Prague. Um, but I can't remember. Hi, Osiel. It's so nice to see you. But yeah, I mean, that's why when Israel decided to see, this is an interesting question that it's always been. I mean, it's an ethical one too. But like even people who are against the state of Israel, right, who are anti-Zionist, will often be like, but the Eichmann trial it was good that they did it. And I'm not saying one way or another. I'm just saying like I think to me that Wilhelm Stuckart. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Uh, But like some people will say like the Eichmann trial was a good thing that Israel did, right? That they did, right? Because it was. But I think to me it's like again it's something that I mean even Hannah Arendt sort of talks about how like the Zionists like their own conception of the trial and their own reasoning for the trial for bringing it about anyway was not necessarily this like sense of justice but something else, right? um Wilhelm Stuttgart, you mean? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, again, but with the Eichmann trial, like that's one where, like, if you watch the full trial, it goes on for ages because they have so many people giving testimony, so many people giving testimony. The Eichmann trial, it's literally all on YouTube. You can watch the entire trial. Um, um, and and uh, and it was interesting too because they have to mount a defense, right? Like it's not like, oh, they just sentenced him, right? They said no, we have to bring up all this testimony. But again, remember, this is when Israel had just become well, not just become, it happened at 61, but the point being that Israel was not exactly an old country, right? It was fairly recently created. But the whole point was that it meant that the judges in the Beit HaMishpat, right, the House of Justice, which is what they call the High Court then, and even the people when dealing with Eichmann had to speak in German, right? It's this like really weird thing to listen. Like if if you know the context of it, it's like very strange that like the Chief Justice, like the one that's asking him a lot of questions, he's asking him in German. And it's just like so weird, right? But it's because he doesn't want to have to go through an interpreter, right? He's like, I don't want my questions to be, right? And because he was, spoke German, he was a German Jewish person. But yeah, it's such a fascinating trial. But yeah, like I don't know, like it's such a strange ethical question, if only because people will say, well, it's good that they tried him and they brought up all this testimony and that they showed all of this evidence and et cetera, and they actually let him mount a defense. But then it's because it's the state of Israel, it's kind of like, how do we feel about that, right? Like it's kind of this double bind. But Hannah Arendt kind of makes it, kind of sort of talks about it in that like it was meant to be somewhat of a show trial, right? But again, that's not really a discussion for now. And that's in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem. But yeah, like you can watch the whole trial on YouTube. It's fascinating because again, they are doing a trial in the state of Israel, right? And they like the crimes, right? The indictment includes crimes against the Jewish people, right? Because this is still when, and this is how I'm trying to tie it back to when we were talking about the UN stuff, is that was their way of trying to have a definition of genocide that specified, right, the uniqueness of the anti-Semitic, the anti-Jewish stuff that that brought about the final solution, right? And so that's why like some of those, I mean, like those crimes have never been used in an indictment ever since in Israel, mainly because they never had someone else like Eichmann brought to trial, but he was the highest Nazi ever tried in Israel, and well, the only one actually technically. But yeah, the whole point being that they wanted to get as much testimony out, and that's why it's a fascinating trial because again, there are things that, I mean, this just shows how long this trial is. There are stuff that even in the books that talk about it, cannot cover all of the testimony that was brought in, because they let people give all of their full testimony, right? Because they were like, otherwise, like if we don't get it down on the record, there's nothing to say that it will be, remembered, right? And I think that's another thing too when we're talking about like what happens against trans people. It's like some people are like, oh, it's best to just leave it be or whatever. But it's kind of this idea that having it recorded somewhere is better than having it, possibly be taken down. So anyway, so okay, so we're gonna raid Talworks because I have to go make dinner. But thank you so much for joining me this stream. I will see you all very soon on Monday. Thank you so much for joining me again. I hope you enjoyed the stream, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you so much. Bye.